I want to thank everyone for coming today. My name is Andrew Gilman. I'm a part of the Storage Solutions team at Dell. I'm joined by my other solution colleagues here. We have our solution specialist, Todd Day, and William Urban, our solutions engineer. As you notice, there's no product in our titles, so we're all about solutions here. And today what we're going to be talking about is how you can achieve a cost breakthrough for your virtual desktop infrastructure using the combination of 10 gig solid-state disks, storage virtualization, and the goal of today is really give you some ideas for how you can begin to think about your virtual desktop implementation in a different way to achieve some of the efficiencies that you're trying to get, and not to introduce more cost and complexity into your environment, which it tends to be what most vendors and strategies around VDI wants you to do. So that's what we're talking about today. You can follow Dell on Twitter at Dell at VMworld. And what we're going to be talking about today is I'm going to talk a little bit about some new storage technologies, the strategies around virtual desktop that we think are a place to start to get there efficiently. And turn it over to Todd Day, who spends 99% of his time in the field working with our customers to understand how to design and what are the design considerations for setting up their own virtual desktop infrastructures. And then we're going to turn it over to our engineer in residence, Will, who's going to talk about some of the ways that we can efficiently use some of the new technologies both at Dell and at VMware to get there more efficiently. So before we start, in our customer meetings, we like to ask, so what are and we want to keep this as interactive as possible, so nobody just likes to sit there. So can I get a show of hands if, I'm going to ask you, why are you thinking about VDI? Can I get a show of hands if they're all about security? So it's security considerations. How about a Win 7 migration? Does that have something to do with it? How many people is it about OpEx savings? Okay. So I always like to start with data. If you were at the Gartner conference last year, I know we had a lot of respondents. We didn't have as many respondents, but OpEx is clearly the place where people are trying to get a lot of efficiencies by going to a virtual desktop infrastructure. Windows migration, security compliance, replace PCs with thin clients, and operational cost savings was by far and away the reason why we're looking to extend the benefits of virtualization to the desktop to achieve that OpEx savings. Again, anytime you can not have to fight or fire with a lost desktop or seamlessly patch your entire 1,000+ seat desktop environment, that has significant benefits for you as administrators and to your business from a business agility perspective. So in doing so, the next question on this at this Gartner conference is, okay, so you want to deploy virtual desktops to achieve greater OpEx savings. So virtual desktop means you need to deploy enterprise-class SANs, storage, enterprise-class SANs, networking, and there are all these new requirements to achieve that. So now that you're trying to achieve OpEx savings with your VDI, how much storage are you going to dedicate to each virtual desktop image? And wouldn't you be shocker to see that they still want to dedicate between 10 and 20 gigabytes of storage for their VDI? Now, in thinking about what we're all trying to do with a virtual desktop environment, which is both extend the CapEx savings of our virtualization deployments while introducing more automation and OpEx savings, we're kind of undoing that by just taking our disks, our storage disks that were in our laptops, which were cheap and inexpensive, and now bringing them into and introducing them into an internal cloud infrastructure, which connotes very expensive enterprise-class storage where you need specialized expertise to maintain and make sure that you're maximizing their efficiency. So the whole idea that you want to achieve this OpEx savings and then deploy a lot of expensive storage doesn't make sense. So we need to figure out a better way to do that. So here's how we're going to help you achieve a cost breakthrough for your virtual desktop environments. And it follows this strategy, and we'll transition and talk about some specific ways that you can do that using new technology from the storage side as well as from the VMware side. So first and foremost, we need to make sure that our architecture in and of itself is designed for efficiency. Meaning if you're currently on a fiber channel infrastructure, taking a look at iSCSI as a way to, again, reduce more capital expenditures out of that, as well as to be able to leverage your existing IP networking skills and expertise that you can achieve through iSCSI storage, because it's basically standard Ethernet practices. Next is deployment and transitioning to 10 gigabit Ethernet as a way to unify your fabrics to drive out more costs. And then next thing we want to do is tackle the shared storage costs. So here's where we can introduce storage virtualization technology, which has a lot of automation capabilities, allows you to offload a lot of the common management tasks that you once had to use when you were using fiber channel storage, and move that down and build the intelligence into the SAN layer. And then we can introduce solid-state disks where it makes sense. Solid-state disks tend to be, enterprise-class solid-state disks tend to be very, very expensive. And what we're trying to do here is have a targeted usage of those SSD disks in common virtual desktop deployment scenarios so that you can achieve that efficiency and have that super hotspot within your infrastructure to manage around some of the costs there. The next thing that Todd's going to hit on is really around sizing your desktop images properly. Certainly that 10 to 20 gig per VM user isn't scalable as you think about deploying tens or hundreds or thousands of virtual desktops into an enterprise environment. You also need to consider virus patch management into the overall design of the image, as well as need to think about how to utilize other technologies that allow you to automate and get more scale from a deployment perspective, and automate deployments like link clones that help you also reduce storage costs. And then the next thing is we want to make sure that once we've virtualized our Ethernet storage and virtualized our virtual servers, that we have the interconnected API capabilities that we've been hearing a lot about today at VMworld, this week at VMworld, around automation. So being able to optimize the virtual server and the virtual storage environments for greater efficiency. With VAI, as we all have seen, you can rapidly deploy your VMs up to 70+% a lot faster. So it makes sense for being able to automate that process. So starting off at the infrastructure layer, just to set the stage, 10 gigabit Ethernet in action. As you scale and grow your environment, your VMware environment, as you introduce new capabilities like fault tolerance, vMotion, and as you introduce things like virtual desktops, you're going to have a lot of chattiness, right? So there's a lot of networking capability that needs to happen, a lot of networking paths that need to be managed. 10 gigabit Ethernet allows you to have a big pipe that can grow and scale with your implementation over time. And it supports and it takes your consolidation projects, if you're at the first stage of the customer journey, and extends that to the networking level. So from a cost savings perspective, 10 gigabit Ethernet, there's a lot of data out there, but unifying your networks has a real significant cost savings, up to 76% in this specific case. And if anybody's interested in seeing where this report came from, we can certainly send it to you. But 76% cost savings over having separate networks. That's a CapEx savings, but it's also an OpEx savings as you think about how much it costs to hire a fiber channel staffing. It's approximately 10% more than traditional Ethernet staffing. So there's an OpEx and a CapEx standpoint to unifying your fabric onto 10 gig, as well as a architectural decision that has to be made as to how flexible and how you can put in place a network that's going to support a growing virtual desktop infrastructure. The next part of the discussion is really around how can we, we're all on this virtualization journey. Can I get a show of hands? How many people are 0 to 20% virtualized? How about 20 to 40? 40 to 60? 60 to 80? 80 to 100? Oh, 100%. Yay. So everyone's on this virtualization journey. We've all been able to achieve cost savings through consolidation. The next step is how do we get more out of that? And automation is the way that we're going to get more savings out of our infrastructure from an OpEx standpoint. So the cornerstone of Dell's strategy around that automation is around storage virtualization. And with next generation storage, the whole idea is that as your infrastructure grows and scales over time, you're able to keep your overall management costs low as you deploy more terabytes of storage or as you're deploying more virtual machines. And the way that we do so is through simplified storage that's highly automated, that's tightly integrated with your VMware infrastructure through VAAI, and doesn't have a lot of characteristics of traditional SAN storage designs where you have two set of controllers, set amount of networking, and when you want to grow and expand over time, what do? You have to add DAEs or disks, thereby creating a bottleneck in the infrastructure when you grow, and it's not very complementary to VMware implementations. With next generation storage or SAN 2.0, you're able to seamlessly add capabilities as you need them on the fly, and so you don't have to buy overbuy storage at the beginning of your project. Some other key storage technologies for efficient virtual desktop deployments are auto SSD tiering, and Will's going to talk a little bit about that. With auto SSD tiering, we're able to create that super hotspot within a SAN infrastructure where we can have targeted usage of the SSD drives within a single frame and put the user data from a virtual desktop deployment onto cheaper, more efficient disks like SATA disks or SAS disks. With auto SSD tiering, we can auto load balance then, so in a boot up scenario, you can have targeted usage of the SSDs for your Gold Master images or your View Composer capability, and then store your user data on the SAS drives. Thin clones also help you drive up your storage utilization by not taking a full clone, and so as you grow and change, the amount of data stored increases, you're able to use thin clones in scenarios that will talk about, where we want to rapidly deploy virtual desktop images using the combination of VAAI and thin clones. And then last but not least, the last key storage technology that we'll talk about is VAAI, which is the tight integration between the SAN infrastructure and offloads that offloads the data storage capabilities from the hypervisor layer onto the SAN. So at Dell, we've been working very, very closely with VMware to bring the VAAI capabilities to market, actually building on them from the beginning with the vCenter Site Recovery Manager storage plugin. We're one of the first vendors to work with them and to introduce that capability to market. Building on that, most recently through VMware vSphere 4.1, we've enhanced that to bring forth the multipath extension module, which VMware in vSphere 4.1 came out with the pluggable storage appliance capability. And so with the PSA, we're able to write a multipath extension module, which allows you to take advantage of all the multiple paths going between the vSphere environment and the storage environment. And so as you think about a virtual storage infrastructure where you're seamlessly adding new nodes to that infrastructure, you're increasing also the network paths as you grow and scale your virtual desktop infrastructure, as one use case goes. With the MEM, or the multipath extension module that's available with vSphere 4.1 and EqualLogic firmware 5.0, we're able to bring the intelligence into the network routing to optimize path management between the environments. We've also built upon the vStorage APIs to help with protecting your virtual machine or your virtual desktop environment through a capability called Auto Snapshot Manager VMware Edition. And this is a capability where we're actually logging into the vCenter server, telling the virtual machines or the virtual desktops to go into snapshot mode, taking a SAN-based snapshot, and then cleaning it all up. And so the idea here is that when you take a virtual machine snapshot, those get stored in VMFS. What we're able to do there is to offload that onto the SAN, and that allows you to have greater scalability and more automated data protection, again, reducing the OpEx associated with protecting your internal cloud infrastructure. And we've written to all the other APIs that have been recently announced, including full copy or Xcopy, hardware-assisted locking, block zeroing, and then we're also working on future integration where we integrate the thin provisioning capability with VMware's thin provision capability. So the proof is in the pudding with these VAI accelerated integrations, and they really show up in the speed and the service levels that you're able to provide your end users. With these capabilities, we're able to accelerate VM provisioning, including VDI provisioning, by up to 72%. Thereby offloading, because we're doing these operations and these copying operations in the SAN layer, we're effectively cutting out the network from any load associated from these deployment scenarios. So you're able to reduce your, say, network traffic by up to 95%, and while at the same time reducing CPU load because we're offloading it from the server layer onto the SAN. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Todd, who's going to tell you a little bit about some sizing considerations and best practices for those images now that we're ready to deploy on a virtual storage infrastructure. So.
Good deal. Thank you, Andrew. All right, folks. So when I talk to customers about their infrastructure, invariably the questions around 10 gig and sizing their infrastructure, I get into how many users can I fit onto X? What's the responsiveness going to be? And I usually very quickly change the conversation as we go through it to focus on this aspect first, which is the end user environment and how we build that image. And the reason is because how that image is designed and how it's laid out and delivered to those users is going to impact everything from your storage to your server count and to the networking requirements as well, especially when you start layering on iSCSI traffic onto a 10 gig network. So you may need 2 10 gig ports, you may need 4. You may need 50 servers, you may need 8. It really does all depend. And so we spent a lot of time here focusing on this. So the first piece is that user profile. How do we move that out? So the goal being making that image relatively stateless. In other words, as a user, I can log in and get a new OS, whether it's Windows 7 or XP, and my profile is going to follow me. The next step would be, defining that OS level. What's in that OS? Is it, virus management, systems management, maybe Office components, because everyone's got to have Office, but we're going to standardize on a version. So if someone happens to need an older version of Excel or Word or what have you, we could layer that on in a different mechanism, but that base OS is a known entity that we can manage to and provide to a whole host of user types in our environment. I've talked to folks in large organizations that have what they call business application mixes. They have 400 different application mixes with 1,500 different applications. You show them this, and they fall over trying to figure out how are we going to do that, right? And there's a lot of reasons that drive you down that path. If you're in that situation, I start talking about finding the use cases that make the most sense because you can't boil the ocean. So once we do that, then of course it gets into the applications, right? What can we leave in that OS, or what can we abstract out and deliver through some sort of virtualization, whether it's streaming it down to it via thin app or delivering it right into the desktop and into that environment. So you take some of those, what I call tier 2 or 3 applications, and those are delivered in that mechanism, abstracted out from that base image. And this is going to impact I/O. It's going to impact the performance of that environment and in a lot of different ways. So as we move forward, then of course, security, right? There's a lot of folks, a handful of folks looked at the data, security, intellectual property, right? A lot of the early adopters of VDI, that was the main use case. They had developers all over the place, and they wanted to maintain their intellectual property in a core data center so they could back it up and protect it and know that it didn't end up on a laptop in the back of someone's taxi cab accidentally. So we've heard all those stories. So having your data abstracted out and secured is obviously a key piece. Now, after we've done all that, and we've figured out how we're going to start slicing and dicing up our user profiles and deliver that to them, which isn't an easy feat, I realize that, and I've spent a lot of time talking about that. We then start looking at, all right, from an access perspective, how are the users going to get there? What protocols are we going to leverage? Because that's going to determine the end user experience, but it's also going to determine what bandwidth you need. If you're using RDP, it's going to be a smaller footprint on the network. If it's PC over IP, it's going to be a higher footprint. Now, depending on the latency that you have in those networks, if you have users in a local area network, you might use RDP because the end user experience will be sufficient based on the network's capability. But you have users that are on a high latent connection, they're going to need PC over IP likely to maintain that end user experience. So what we're talking about is if I'm looking through an Adobe document, a PDF, or if I'm scrolling through any documents, or I'm watching a multimedia training session or what have you, the jitterness, the experience of that scrolling of that document will be impacted by the network and its capabilities. And then, of course, we always look at managing those service levels on the network, partitioning traffic with VLANs, and using some of the functionality in VMware's virtual distributed switch to manage any type of network I/O contention is another key aspect. And of course, SSL authentication in that aspect, you want to have it behind load balancing component. You want to be able to provide, a seamless or a experience for the users. Should a broker in your environment go offline for whatever reason, you want their sessions easily transferred over, and you want to have load balancing there. So integration with folks at Juniper F5 and so forth. Most of you probably have some sort of load balancing in your environment. A View connection broker sits behind that, fantastic, and can handle that for you. But that gives you the ability to scale out, add more connection servers as your demand increases, and so forth. With a broker, not so much as choosing the broker, but the design of it. So whether you do a persistent user state or a non-persistent is based on the user classifications. We talk about task workers or call center folks, manufacturing. If you have folks on a shop floor, they need a kiosk to enter data routinely. They may fit well into a non-persistent image. Typically, I try and lead folks to a design around non-persistent because that gives you the best benefits to that previous slide and the ability that every day I get a fresh OS. So if I had a patch cycle come through, the next day it's a fresh OS with those patches in there. And having that ability is handy with traveling workers and things of that nature. But it doesn't work for everyone because there's a lot of impacts that has on some applications when you refresh the base OS on a regular basis. Dynamic pools give you the ability to kind of scale up and scale down your infrastructure. So you may need 100 desktops in it during the day, but in the evening, if you have call centers or you have evening workers, that can drop down. Or if you're opening up a new office and you're moving users over to VDI, you can scale that up as you go, as opposed to getting all the servers and all the infrastructure and spinning up all these virtual machines and kind of waiting for someone to come. So now you're talking about desktop on demand as we go down that path. With the protocol, with whether it's ICA, RDP, PC over IP, when you're talking about your virtual desktop, you want to look at disabling unnecessary or chatty services within that image. Because again, if there's a whole bunch of chattiness on that 10 gig line, you're going to need more 10 gig lines. You're going to start needing more bandwidth for non-essential traffic. So we want to get that chattiness off there. And let me just build this out. I'm not much for suspense. There we go. All right. As we talked about before, the digital logic, which is your applications that you're presenting to those users. So in View 4.5, which is announced here at VMworld, they're talking about the ability to tie a Ethernet package to a user. So you can define those packages and say, all right, for my HR group, here are your packages. And through that, you can meter the software delivery from that mechanism. So you can present it in a way that it's streamed down to that user or it's embedded into their image. It's still abstracted from that OS, so if you refresh it and give them a newer version of Windows XP or Windows 7, it's still abstracted out, but that's that presentation layer. Profiles, the end user profiles, and whenever I say roaming profiles, everyone kind of does one of them and gets real nervous because roaming profiles tend to be a bit challenging on the network. It's come a long ways if you're looking at leveraging Microsoft and Active Directory 2008, but there's also a lot of other technologies out there. RTO software, which VMware acquired, will be later on integrated into it, but gives you the ability to give that user's persona, abstract it out to them, and have a follow-me type desktop environment. So place that out onto the storage area network, onto low-cost storage, having access from any point. So when they go from an upgrade of Windows 7 to XP, other way around, XP to 7, that's not an impact there. Or if they're traveling, for example, if you have folks that are going overseas, executives, directors, things of that nature, and they're on virtual desktops, you can have that data replicated over to those other sites, provided you have virtual desktop infrastructure there, and they can access those desktops from that side of the equation as well. Proximity is important when you talk about that. If you're getting your desktops overseas, end user experience may be a problem. So separating that profile data out is obviously a key as well. CPU and memory utilization, I get, as I said before, you get those questions, right? It does depend on the workload. So the profile type, a knowledge worker, a power user, and things of that nature. There's a slide coming up. I talk about what we've seen to date with users per core in that area, so we'll hit on that. And we'll talk about streamlining your virus scanning. By far and away, out of every infrastructure I've been involved with, that's been the biggest problem area with I/O contention is the virus management. In other words, doing virus management you do on desktops today doesn't fit at all into a VDI environment because now you're scanning all of the same data on your SAN and you're creating all sorts of I/O contention. So there's strategies to address that, and then there's of course technology with the vShield functionality that VMware's bringing into the market that folks will take advantage of to offload that entirely from the desktops. And of course, optimizing the image, disabling screensavers and all sorts of visual effects can impact your performance, i.e. impact your bandwidth requirements. All right, so capacity, favorite question. ESXi or ESX, I think that at this point, if you deploy anything out, you should seriously consider ESXi because next year it will be pretty much here in the standard. So if you can do it, great. Leveraging DRS and HA, I think that's kind of a no-brainer if you have the access to it and so forth, because dynamic resource management, even in a desktop world, is important. Backup, not so much of a thing with desktops, maybe the user data and so forth, obviously. But virus management through the VMware Update Manager is an option, but a lot of folks tend to integrate it with their existing strategy. But that's an option to deal with that virus I/O contention issue. A lot of folks today are zeroing in on a 2-socket server for the best price-performance ratio. In other words, how much your licensing costs you and then how far you can scale out on desktops. That seems to be the sweet spot. And of course, your profile is going to determine how many cores or how many processors and how much memory you need. But on average, we're seeing somewhere between 6 to 16. 6 being, I got a lot of power users, heavy hitters, 2 virtual CPUs, 2 to 4 gigs of memory. They're requiring a lot of resource. But for the most part, the sweet spot or the bulk of the workloads are those knowledge workers that fall into about the 10 users per core range based on their workload profile. I threw in here some of the maximums for ESX4 Update 1 because a lot of folks ran into problems there in the recent release of 4.1 that has changed drastically, and I have a slide to kind of summarize that. But be aware of some of the limitations when you're designing your clusters, and we'll hit on that here in a little bit. So that's what we're seeing for user counts on the 2-socket current Dell platforms with the latest Nehalem chipset and so forth. IOPS, a key area, right? Knowledge worker is somewhere in the, I'd say 8 to 10 IOPS per user is what we're seeing out there when we do our blueprint analysis. But I have people call me up and say, hey, we're testing this out and we're getting 15 or 20 IOPS per user, and they're typical knowledge worker profile, but they're so high up there because they've got all these different agents and virus management and so forth running in their environment that we need to optimize that image. Or, we give them the option. I can sell you, no problem, selling you a whole bunch of hard drives so that we can handle that I/O, right? I really don't want to do that. It doesn't set any of us up for success because eventually there is a glass ceiling and we'll hit it. And if you've ever seen a child or a dog run into a glass window, it's not a pretty sight. It's even worse if you're providing a service to end users. So we want to try and avoid that. And of course, we account for our image design, the hard drive size, the snapshots, and so forth into that design process. 6-core processors are kind of a sweet spot right now. A lot of folks are going to the Enterprise Plus licensing because of the distributed virtual switch and a lot of the different extended functionality in vSphere. And 8-core and 12-core and 16-core processors are going to be, 8 cores are here. The rest are not too far down the road, so it's going to start driving that up. But right now, that's what I'm seeing in the field with a lot of folks. So with antivirus software, we want to make sure and whether it's Symantec, McAfee, Trend, all these guys have some guidance on what to turn off, what to leave on for the environment to optimize for VDI, because they've all seen it and run into it. But these are some of the high levels across the board. You don't need all the add-on features for every different package. You want to do the core functionality. You want to put the agent in the master virtual machine and update the master if you're using link clones. If you're not, then you obviously go the traditional method. But be aware that's a huge amount of I/O if you, for example, I had a customer had about 4,000 virtual desktops, and every night their policy was to refresh or do a data update. The policy drove about 1 billion IOs through their storage frame. The policy didn't really match what they needed to do, so we had to change the policy. And once we did that, we've got to a more reasonable service level for that environment. But if you're using link clones, you can put that in the master, refresh the master, and voila, everyone has it. So your I/O drops drastically. If you're you take your scans, randomize them. Look at how you can distribute that across the environment, so you don't scan everything all at the same time of day. And then, of course, exclude certain files from that, page file, PST, things of that nature, because you don't really want to put the I/O on that. And I just couldn't stop. I had so many ideas. So you want to categorize your applications. We talked about this earlier when you look at stripping out the applications, tier 1 in the base OS, 2 and 3, and so on. You look at embracing some sort of strategy for virtualizing those applications. You may have Citrix in-house today with XenApp. It works great into a VMware View environment. It's an ecosystem of solutions that we tie together. Include those corporate applications, as I said before, into the image. Group policy is a great tool for a lot of different mechanisms, from display settings for RDP to redirecting the user data so it doesn't store it locally. You can move it out to the SAN so you can abstract that out. So leverage those tools that you already have and to improve that operational efficiency. And then profile management techniques. As I saw before, liquidware, RTO software, a lot of folks out there have interesting solutions to abstract that out. And we work with a lot of those folks in the field to put together a solution based on what a customer has experience with and what we feel is a good solution to meet their needs. And I keep hitting the turn off non-essential services. At the end of this, there's some links to various documentation that gives you guidance on how to build an image, what to turn off, and so on. So as we get into the sizing, I'm not going to go through all of this here. It's really meant as a guideline to say, know what version of ESX you're running, what version of View you're running, and make sure you check the sizing guidelines from VMware, because it changes and it really has impact on how many hosts in a cluster you can have, how many powered on virtual machines you can have, and things of that nature. It's been drastically changed in 4.1. So if you can go with 4.1 and View 4.5, you're going to be in the best situation, because a lot of the constraints around if I have an 8-host cluster or a 9-host cluster have been eliminated, and they can scale up drastically. So consult that documentation before you go down that path. So that's a lot of work, right? A lot of thought that has to go into that, a lot of planning, and all of it impacts how much this infrastructure is going to cost you. So we've done a lot of reference architectures out there, a lot of testing that the teams have done to validate knowledge worker profiles and so on down the line. But to get there, we usually go through a blueprinting process to make this analysis. So we have a tools-based methodology that will basically drop a tool into your environment, abstract all this information, what all your applications are doing, what your networks look like, what the I/O looks like, and give us a digital thumbprint of your use case. From that, we can then turn it into, instead of a reference architecture, an architecture for your environment. These are really guidelines for design to give you an order of magnitude, but it's always going to vary. So with that building block of 1,000 users, what we typically see, and it's make it $10 for the guy in the back of the row that can read the text. Because I left my wallet in the room. And I knew you couldn't. So it's a little bit small up there, but essentially with an M1000E blade chassis, we did a 1,000 user building block. Does that mean I have to move it? Oh, okay. Thank you. I thought usually it's just a big hook, but that was much nicer. I appreciate that. Thank you. We had 16 half-byte blade servers with 96 gigs of memory, 2-socket, 6-core processors. And then for the networking perspective, we did basically 6 1-gig ports for the virtual machine network traffic console and so forth, and then 2 10-gig uplinks for the iSCSI. I'm seeing a lot of folks skip the 1 gig side of it. I just did a deployment last month where basically we did 2 10 gig uplinks for a infrastructure. It was 1,600 users. And we're going to use in 4.1 the new functionality around virtual distributed switches to basically carve up into VLANs so we can guarantee traffic for iSCSI. So we're going to give them basically 4 gigs, was what we determined was going to make sense. And the remaining bandwidth we were going to slice up into connectivity for vMotion, for console, and for virtual machine traffic. And it's all isolated and VLANed out and so forth. But that was the design that we went with. Saved them a lot of money and headaches, and simplified their design. But for this reference architecture, that's what we ended up with. We created a single 8-host cluster, averaged about 125 virtual machines per host, and we ended up with somewhere in the neighborhood about 50 kbps per user on the network for network traffic. And these slides will be available later after the event, so I'll kind of get to the end of it here. The user I/O load was about 5 IOPS per user, and that's on the low side there. But for the testing that we were doing at the time, that's where we're at. So we had 16 600 gig SAS drive, 15K RPM drives in this infrastructure. And that's pretty common right there, from a footprint perspective. But the devil's in the details there. So this is a current reference architecture. I think Will's going to talk a little bit about where we're going in the solid state side of the equation, and 10 gig E. Talk a little bit more about how we handle that aspect of it. So, Will.
Thanks, Todd.
The con is yours.
All righty. So I know we're all pretty.
Kept it on time.
Get this all exciting.
Yeah.
So, what's your... Whoa, oh, hey, how are we doing that? So what Andrew and Todd were talking about really is, we have, 5, 6, 7 hours worth of discussion that we could do on individual environments, and we'd love to sit and talk to you guys a little bit more. And so the invitation is obviously come see us in the booth and talk to us about your environments, because really every environment is going to be different, right? One person may be doing 500 users in a call center, another person's doing 1,000 knowledge workers, and somebody else is doing your own internal cloud stuff. So some of the things that we're talking about really is more about your environment's going to depend, but take a look at some of these considerations. Take a look at all of these concepts that we're throwing out at you guys and really figure out how that's going to fit into your environment. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the storage challenges. Andrew started the presentation and he talked about... to dodge between this thing. Andrew started the presentation talking about, it's so much easier to go to your hardware vendor and say, okay, I need 1,000 desktops. You can get them for dirt cheap, right? But then it's the OpEx and the CapEx and everything like that you're really concerned about and you're really worried about. Hybrid arrays in the storage industry are really changing how virtual desktops can really now become truly affordable in your environment. So Dell has a new array called the XVS, and what it really means is it's a half hybrid, it's a hybrid array with half solid state disks and half SAS disks. And now the concept being that you can really start taking advantage of what VMware View is doing with their way that they can tier out the data, and you can start tiering out your own data to really make sure that the cost per gig and the cost per performance really meets the needs that you have for your environment. So for example, in this particular array, you have both solid-state disks and SAS disks. Now with 4.5 and linked clones, there's a new ability that actually allows you to segment out your thin clone or your linked clone base image from your user data, from your temporary scratch files. So you can imagine you don't want to be spending money on solid-state disks where you're putting your my Internet Explorer temporary files and my page files and stuff like that. But you really can take advantage of the solid-state disks for the linked clones ability of being able to deploy multiple virtual machine desktops. Now the other cool thing, like if you think about View 4.0 and how it worked with linked clones, you could create a linked clone image and you could have 64 base images off of that. So every time you had to create another set of 64 images, you'd have to create another base image. So what Andrew was talking about is every time you do a 20 gig or 30 gig image, even though you're linked cloning them, you're still consuming a lot of space. With View 4.5 and the ability of new hybrid arrays out there, you can actually offload that individual virtual machine and spawn off hundreds and hundreds of virtual machines off of that image. Now that desktop image is now residing on solid state disk. So what Todd was talking about is making sure that that image is the most efficient supported image that you can have in your environment, so you really do consolidate the hotspots and the boot storms and the reads off of those solid state disks without having to have an entire solid state disk environment. So that's really what we're talking about when we talk about hybrid arrays and how it's going to really revolutionize what you guys can do, because a lot of it is scalability. Susie Q's PowerPoint presentation doesn't need to sit on very expensive SSD drives, but if you can get 500-600 desktops all spinning up on SSD with linked clone technologies and get the same performance as you could from the local local desktop for the user, and then take advantage of lower tiered storage like SAS and SATA to be able to store the user data, you really can make more of a financial decision that this really is the way you want to go. Now, the other thing about that is the emergence of 10 gig E, right? Because, like Todd was talking about, you have all of these IOs. So, the idea is I want to take the same customer experience, or the customers being your internal users, the same customer experience of sitting in front of my desktop. I want blazing fast YouTube. I want, to be able to, chit chat with my, my friends, or whatever your customers or your users are doing. You want to make sure they have that same user experience. Now that, once it starts going into your back data network, you're now starting to consume a lot of bandwidth to be able to do this. So instead of having to monopolize, hundreds and hundreds of 1 gig E ports, you can start taking advantage of what VMware is doing with their 10 gig and the virtual distributed switches, and you start taking advantage of the 10 gig servers, the 10 gig links, the 10 gig storage, and really consolidating. You've got less cables, you've got better performance, more aggregation. You can really take advantage of the 10 gig stuff in your virtual desktops. Now, not only is 10 gig important for your client network as well, but it's also important for your storage, because again, you're spinning up, instead of spinning up 400 virtual machines running 2008 and Linux and stuff like that, you've actually got thousands of virtual desktops running. And so the storage needs and the storage bandwidth and the storage I/O on the back end of that is also important to keep in mind. So you're not going to have just a couple of 1 gig links going out to your storage. You really need to take advantage of that 10 gig storage infrastructure and the 10 gig infrastructure for your client access as well. So there's a whole bunch of stuff. Just like Todd, we have tons and tons of stuff to talk about 10 gig network considerations. And really, a lot of this stuff is standard, 10 gig Ethernet best practices. And a lot of the vendors out here are going to discuss, the ways that you can take advantage of 10 gig in your environment, whether you're using SFP Plus or whether you're using, whatever kind of cables or whatever. But really, you're talking about, some just basic core tenets. Don't use spanning tree, enable flow control, disable unicast storm controls. And I'm not going to go and read all of these things, but jumbo frame support. Now the cool thing about this is all this stuff is what VMware, Dell, View, all of these, we've all gotten together and said, all right, this is the best way to configure our environments, the best way to, run our 10 gig environments, the best way to utilize View with, desktops and link clones and things like that. Network I/O control is another cool feature that came out in 4.1 that actually allows you to kind of develop a service level agreement or a quality of service for your entire virtual network. So it allows you to isolate things, so you can have, like what Todd was talking about. You can, I don't know if anybody saw the 4.1 vMotion thing that they were talking about, but vMotion by itself is now able to use up to 8 gigs of bandwidth. Now that's the last thing you want to do if you have two 10 gig cards, is let vMotion take up 8 gigs of bandwidth, just for something like that. So you can actually take advantage of network I/O control, isolating different network ports and creating these VLANs. And even though it's a 10 gig card presented to your ESX host, you can still isolate it down and say 4 gigs for this, 2 gigs for that, 5 gigs for that, whatever you want to do to make sure that you meet all the service level agreements for your entire both client and storage network infrastructure. Now, these are required, there are a couple of caveats with this. Obviously it's available on the virtual distributed switch, which is going to require an Enterprise Plus license. So even if you don't do that, you can do some of the flow control stuff without Enterprise Plus licensing to really, again, get that availability and get that network traffic and traffic shaping down the way you want it to. Network I/O control parameters, again, a lot of this stuff is just common stuff that you're talking about when you're looking at your VMware environment, when you're looking at your storage environment and how you connect to it, but you're talking about, bandwidth controls. And, just like you take shares for resource pools for CPU and processor and memory shares, you're taking the same sort of approach to make sure that your clients and your storage and everybody else gets the same sort of I/O control and the I/O service level agreements that you decide are necessary for your environment. And you can actually do this per VM NIC level, per physical host, per virtual machine environment, per VLAN, whatever you want to do. Again, now the cool thing about this is these are all just basic general concepts to keep in the back of your mind, but your environment's going to be different. And again, like Todd was saying, we can actually come in and take a look and say, you know what? You may have 500 users that you're trying to virtualize. Did you know your IOPS are really this, even though you may have thought they were this, or your bandwidth requirements are going to be some of the following. So again, every environment's going to be different, but we have all those tools to be able to kind of tailor that environment for you. And it really does come down to the efficient enterprise, right? So, this is a Dell-sponsored session, so of course we're going to talk about the whole end-to-end solution. The end-to-end solution being, clients to the back-end data center, to the servers, to the storage, to the 10 gig stuff. Everything is seamlessly integrated and everything is seamlessly architected to make sure that you have a tested, true platform for deploying these virtual environments. Now, the cool thing is, you're going to hear all throughout the conference, and you've already heard about, View is huge. I mean, people understand the values of virtualizing servers. So VMware is really pushing on virtualizing desktops. But the thing is, in order to virtualize your desktops, you really have to come to that ROI, CapEx, OpEx, all that stuff that makes sense for you financially inside the data center. Because we all understand the benefits of doing some of this stuff, but now we have to make it cost less. So by taking advantage of some of the 10 gig infrastructure, taking advantage of some of the tiered storage, you really do get that message across that, this now becomes affordable because I can really isolate down these images and I can take advantage of this storage to consolidate my virtual machine image. But don't forget that you still have user data. Just because you can take 500 desktops and isolate them down to a single image doesn't mean you have to throw away the fact that you have 500 users that are still going to require some storage out there. Accelerate the virtual era with Dell at booth 401. Again, like I said, we have 5-6 hours worth of content to talk about. We obviously can't discuss it all. So come by, see us at the booth, talk about it. We have, View clients. We even have a new, the View connection client set up on the Dell Streak. You can talk to us about that. You can see 4.5. You can see the hybrid arrays. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Andrew.
So before we wrap up, we want to make sure that there's some time for Q&A. So feel free to get up and ask us any questions you want about the strategy. But we also want to plug the other sessions, including one today at 4:30 p.m. We have a customer who has accepted in the call for papers, Doug Westhoff from Brown Shoe Company. Brown Shoe Company is a $2.4 billion organization worldwide. Many of the people in the room are probably wearing Brown shoes, and they have a 1,200 seat VMware View deployment. They were in the beta for 4.5. They also were using the hybrid arrays in our beta. And so Doug has a lot of real foot on the street or in-depth insight into how to effectively deploy this. And he himself is working towards deploying more and more and getting up to 60 or 80% of his organization of over 12,000 employees to virtual desktops. In fact, they've already gotten their call centers to be 100% VDI, so he's able to achieve a lot of cost breakthroughs using our technology and the methodologies that we've talked about today. So be sure to see that. If you have time, go to the Storage Super Heavyweight Challenge. Our Director of Product Management at Dell, Eric Schott's going to be there. And tomorrow, we have another session on VMware View 4.5 with Vittorio, who's VMware's VP of Enterprise Desktops. We're going to be there with Doug Westhoff and our CTO, Jim Fitzgerald. So be sure to catch that last and final super session tomorrow. So with that, we can open up the floor to any questions or comments. And if you could all fill out your survey cards and give us 100% great marks, that would be great. We'd appreciate it. Thank you all very much. And we'll stay around for questions. If you want to come up, that'd be great.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.